It's great to be with you all today. My name is Minnie Timaraju. I'm the President and CEO of Reproductive Freedom for All. Thank you. And I am incredibly honored to be here today for this discussion. I want to thank the senators, Senator Casey, Bob Casey, Senator Tammy Duckworth, Congresswoman Susan Wild, your hometown champion, and Elise Casey, a social worker and an advocate for IVF. Look, we all know what we're dealing with here. 2 years ago, the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, and we've been facing the devastating consequences ever since. And we've seen the ramifications so broadly on so many aspects of women's health, including IVF and contraception, which is what we're going to dig into today. Look, reproductive freedom is clearly on the ballot, and we know where Pennsylvanians stand on this issue. They are overwhelmingly in support of access to reproductive freedom, and that means all the options and all the care that we need to be healthy and to thrive in this country, right? And look, Senator Casey, I'm just so proud to announce that we've endorsed him in this election. And we did so because he met the moment, and he's been a fighter for us in the Senate. He supported the Women's Health Protection Act. That's the legislation that's going to fix this mess and get us out of this crisis. It's going to expand and protect abortion access in all 50 states, and we desperately need that. And it's going to help us protect IVF and contraception. So we're so grateful to you for your support of that legislation. And finally, his opponent, Dave McCormick, is just incredibly extreme. Too extreme for this state, too extreme for this country. We need common sense solutions, and we need fighters for the regular people, and that is Bob Casey. So with that, I'm going to moderate a discussion because I know you want to hear from our guests, not me, and I'm really excited to start. All right. Senator Casey, it's really good to be here in your home state with you. Following the overturning of Roe, I know that reproductive rights and access and IVF, it's been a huge focus across the country and in this election. I know you've been talking about it a lot. You're running for re-election. Can you say more about what your priorities would be and talk about this issue of attacks on IVF and contraception?
Yeah, Minnie, I want to start by thanking you for, let's hear from Minnie, for moderating here and for her leadership as well. Minnie, thank you for doing this. Senator Tammy Duckworth, we're honored that she's here with us.
Thank you, Bob.
There aren't many times you can have both a combat veteran and a senator in one person in Pennsylvania at the same time. So we're grateful for that. And Susan Wild, thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. My daughter, Elise, it's great we can campaign together. And that was
pretty awesome.
That was her son who just left the room. I might have to run up there and help out.
He can join us.
I try to be a pretty good grandfather. But look, this is a major issue, not just in my re-election campaign for the Senate. It's a major issue in every congressional district, every Senate race, and of course at the presidential level in this presidential election. And the world changed in 2022. When the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade. And at that moment, the country was asking, I think a major question is, what is going to happen next? How will that right be restored? And the only way to restore it, at least in terms of legislative restoration, which you have to do, is to pass the Women's Health Protection Act. I've already voted for that to advance it in the Senate. My opponent, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, said it made him, quote, very, very happy, unquote. That's what he said. And said in a debate the year before, I'm sorry, at that same time in 2022, said in a debate that he supported the exception, only one exception, not an exception for rape, not an exception for incest. I put that on the table because that is the foundation of this conversation today. Because we wouldn't be talking about the access to IVF if Roe v. Wade were not overturned. And so what we've got to do, Minnie, is next year we're going to get another shot
That's right.
at passing in the Senate the Women's Health Protection Act. That's part one. Part two is to pass Senator Duckworth's IVF bill. That's what we got to do.
Thank you. And all these rights are tied together, right? They're all intrinsically connected. And I know Senator Duckworth and your Congresswoman Susan Wild have the legislation, the right to IVF bill in the House and the Senate. I'm going to start with you, Senator Duckworth. Can you say a little more about the bill and what the pathway is? And then I'm going to ask the Congresswoman to also talk about the pathway in the House and why you both did this pretty fast. And you already were working on this issue and it's personal for you.
It is very personal. I had both my daughters through IVF after 10 years of infertility struggle tied to my military service. So I came to this from a personal experience, but then I started working on access to IVF for military men and women. We had a lot of military men and women, especially men who came back from Afghanistan who'd stepped on landmines and lost their reproductive organs. But the VA and the DOD did not cover IVF. My combat wounds are also what led to my becoming infertile and 10 years of struggle. And at the time, the VA and DOD did not cover IVF. And so the path to getting this bill passed, the Right to IVF Act passed, it started with two things. I went to the floor and asked unanimous consent to have the bill passed. The Republicans, had they not opposed it, it would have passed. They opposed it twice on the floor. And then we brought it to the floor for a vote twice. And only two Republicans voted for it, Senators Collins and Murkowski. Thank you, Bob, for voting for it both times to ensure the right to access IVF for all Americans. And all the bill does, it says that if you want to access reproductive health care, you have the right to do that no matter where you live in this country. If you are a doctor or a medical facility and you want to offer reproductive health care, you can, but you don't have to. You can if you want to. And then if you're a health insurance company and you want to sell health insurance that covers IVF, then you have the right to sell insurance. That's the way it was when we originally wrote it. That's all it says. It doesn't force it on anyone, but it would allow Americans to have access to that bill. That's why it was fast, because we had that already in place when we started coming under extreme attack, which is at which point we came up with our bill. And you're my companion in the House. I have the Senate version, which also added more access to for military men and women, and also to bring down the cost of IVF meds. That's it. It's very simple, and yet the Republicans oppose it.
So I started working on mine very soon after the Dobbs decision. I went back to my team after I read the Dobbs decision a few times. I was a lawyer, and I read that decision multiple times, and the thought I kept coming back to is they are going to come for IVF. Mm-hmm. Now, Justice Thomas had actually hinted, more than hinted in his opinion, that they were coming for other things too, but IVF was very much at the top of my mind. I have not had IVF, but I did struggle with infertility for a long time. I know the devastation of it. I know how hard it is. And more importantly, I have multiple friends and family members who only have families because of IVF. And so I started thinking about that. And let me just, for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with IVF, the folks who believe that life begins at the moment of conception are the reason that IVF is in danger. Because if you believe that life begins at the moment that an egg is fertilized with a sperm, then you can't possibly believe that IVF is okay. All right? And I'm not going to get into a whole long medical discussion. Happy to talk to anybody who wants to know more afterwards, but I don't want to take up our time with that. But so these people that and what happened, so we worked on our bill for a year. And then in January of this year, we dropped the bill. And 3 weeks later, I believe it was, the Alabama case came down. So we didn't know that was coming. You didn't know that was coming. We were both very focused on this issue because personal circumstances are people we knew. And thank goodness we were ready to act quickly and get these done. And I will tell you, a lot of people have kind of been like, well, what's the big deal? Like, it seems like most people are in favor of IVF. And by the way, you'll hear Republican politicians now all claiming that they think IVF is a great thing. The only problem is you just heard that only 2 Republican senators voted for Senator Duckworth's bill. 2 women, right, exactly.
Right.
And so I always say, believe them when they tell you who they are, but don't just believe them what they say today. Look back at what they've done. My opponent has been endorsed consistently by the Pennsylvania Pro-Life Association, which believes that life begins at the moment of conception. My opponent has voted voted in favor of abortion bans that have no exceptions for rape or incest. He will tell you today that he's never voted for that. Untrue. He voted for 2 bills that had no exceptions, and he was called out for it by a debate moderator when we did Blue Ridge Cable debate. The proof points are there. So you really need to look at what politicians have stood for in the past and understand that if they are all in on life begins at the moment of conception, they cannot consistently be for IVF.
So I wanted to expand on that. I'll give you my example. When I had my first round of IVF, we created 5 fertilized eggs. 3 of those eggs were non-viable. They stopped growing after 24 hours. And had the doctor put those 3 eggs in me, they would have caused a miscarriage. And so all of these groups that are opposed to IVF, that believe life begins at conception, that act of we discarded those 3 eggs because they would have caused miscarriages, that act could be deemed as murder or manslaughter, which is what's happened in Alabama. And so you've got these groups that actually are either opposed to IVF completely, or they're saying if you have those fertilized eggs, you must implant even the non-viable ones. It will create a miscarriage. And Bob, I think your opponent accepted money from one of these anti-IVF groups. And so again, listen to what they tell you who they are. And you've got a choice between Bob Casey, somebody who has stood up for working families, has stood up for healthcare, has stood up for child care, is standing up for women's access to reproductive, our right to make our own decisions, or someone who takes money from a group that thinks that the right to start a family should be beyond most Americans.
Yes, thank you. It's really hard to believe, but something that I just want to repeat that the Vice President says a lot is one does not need to abandon your personal faith to believe that these decisions should be left between healthcare providers and patients, right? You can believe all kinds of things, but you shouldn't get in the way of our abilities and our freedom to decide if, when, and how to have a family. And that's what we know the majority of Pennsylvanians support, and that's what we stand for, right? Political interference should stay out of it. We should have control about what we do, and we should be able to follow science. Right? So I'm just so honored to be able to support Senators Duckworth and Wild in this legislation, and our group has been actively lobbying on it, and we're going to continue to make sure that gets passed. So yeah, we're excited. It's going to pass. But in order to pass, we got to take back the House, and we are on our way. We are on track with your election, and we got to hold the Senate, which we do not do without Bob Casey. But Elise, I want you to talk a little bit about this because you have a really personal experience that I think is really important to share, and I'm so grateful that you're willing to share it. I also want to say it's unfortunate that we have to ask so many women to share these intensely personal, intimate stories, but it is how we're reshaping the way Americans think about this. But I know it's hard, and I really appreciate it that you're willing to do it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. I really feel so excited and honored to be able to speak up here with everyone, so I really appreciate you having me. I am a mom of 2 boys solely because of IVF, so this issue is very personal to me. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. You may have just heard my 2-year-old run out of here crying a few minutes ago because he wanted to hang out with me. But I just feel so fortunate that I have 2 healthy boys right now. And my journey with IVF started about 6 years ago. After learning I had a pretty common medically diagnosable condition that makes it much more harder to become pregnant naturally. So I actually hopped on the computer, Googled fertility clinics near me, found an amazing doctor, an amazing clinic that helped me and my husband build our family on our own terms. And so I think about this a lot, of how lucky I was to be able to have that access, because it's so hard. I think you hear story after story of how many years and how long it takes to build the families that you want to. And so I think about how lucky I was to have that access that is being taken from women on a daily basis right now. And then the other layer of that is that I had so much support. I had support from my family, from my coworkers, from work to have the time off to be able to build my family on my own terms. And even with all of the access and all of the support, it still was really hard. You have to go through surgeries called egg retrievals. You have to do something called an embryo transfer. You have to do, I think at this point I've done like thousands. My mom might know at this point, thousands of shots to make sure I could carry a healthy baby to term, 2 healthy babies to term. Financially, it's very expensive. Very expensive. So many doctor's office visits, so many blood work, blood draws, and so much waiting. Is it going to work? Is it going to work? It doesn't work. You have to try again. Months and months and months and years in many cases. I know Senator Duckworth waited years and years for her daughters. And so it really terrifies me, to be honest, and infuriates me that there are people that are trying to just make that harder for women. It doesn't make any sense to me because at this point in 2024, we should be expanding access to the science and these reproductive technologies that we have this amazing access to. And so my dad, throughout his campaign, has been talking about rights. And I really believe this election is about women's rights and women being able to access the rights that they need to build their families on their terms. And so I'm here speaking. I actually don't speak in public very often, so this is a newer thing for me. But I am here and speaking out about this very personal issue because it's so important in this election. And I'm worried that if Democrats aren't elected, that IVF could be banned on a national level, as they've said it and they've talked about it. And I'm very fearful that they would do it. And so I'm hopeful that in a few days now that Pennsylvanians elect my dad, Congresswoman Wild, and others to protect these rights that are so crucial for women across the country.
Thank you, Elise. I mean, listen, it's these personal stories, Senator Duckworth's, Elise's, that are really, again, shaping and shifting how folks are reacting to the Dobbs decision and understanding what freedoms are on the line, right? We've been forced to sort of have these uncomfortable conversations out loud, but I really encourage you, if you haven't shared your story, even though you shouldn't have to, with your own friends and family, it can make a big difference in how they decide to vote in a week. The election is in a week. Wow, we have a week to get folks motivated and engaged. So, Senator Casey, I'm going to ask you to kind of close, because I think, well, we might have time for one more round of questions. One or two. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about what you're seeing when you're out there in the state and you've been talking to a lot of Pennsylvanians about this issue. And, you know, you've been a senator, you've been representing these folks for a long time. You know their hearts and minds. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're hearing and how it's shaping, you know, the way you think about this work?
Well, Minnie, I don't think I've ever seen more Pennsylvanians engaged on the basic question of rights. Yeah. This has never happened in my lifetime. Nothing even close. We never had to debate whether we'd have the protection of voting rights and that our democracy would be secure. We've never had to debate that. We never had to debate, at least for 50 years, a basic right that a woman has to make her own decisions. That wasn't at risk like it is now, and it's been not just at risk, taken away and has to be restored. We haven't been debating very much over the last 50 years workers' rights. It was assumed that they'd be protected. Now they're at risk as well. But when it comes to something as fundamental as not just the basic right for a reproductive health care, but for something as essential to the life of a woman and the life of a family, about whether or not they can become a mother or not. I wouldn't be a grandfather if it weren't for IVF, as Elise just outlined. And I'm supposed to listen to lectures from politicians on the right who are going to tell our families what to do? There's only one remedy here. We got to beat these guys. Yeah. Got to win the election. That's what we're going to do. And you know what? Minnie, we've got 7 days, but we're not done working. We're going to continue to work and defeat Mr. McCormick and win the presidential race here in Pennsylvania and send these billionaires that are backing his campaign, paying for 80% of his ads, 80% funded by billionaires who don't live here. out-of-state billionaires coming into Pennsylvania to lecture us about who's going to be their senator, to lecture us about rights. We're going to beat these guys.
It's so true. I've been in a couple of other states, and it's like there's an epidemic of billionaires coming into these states and challenging the fundamentals of our freedoms. And I'm just so grateful you're fighting this fight for all of us. It's so important. And if we don't win the entire federal trifecta, we don't get to move this legislation. I know you're trying to jump in here, and I want to hear from you.
I want to
Susan.
say two quick things that I think are really important. Number one, this is not just a women's issue.
Amen.
For every man in this room who has children or hopes to have children someday, or is married to somebody or with a woman who he cares deeply about, this is about your rights as well. That's number one. And number two is, don't let them fool you by saying, oh, but we're leaving it up to the states to make the decision. And if you're in Pennsylvania, they say to you, in Pennsylvania, you've got the right to have IVF, or you have the right to have an abortion. Because number one, that can change on a dime depending on the political cycle. But number two, what that means is that people across this country, all Americans, do not have equal rights. That means if you're in a state that does not allow abortion, does not allow IVF, then you are a lesser American than somebody who is in a state that does. And the last thing I want to say, and this is kind of to your point, Senator Duckworth, about military folks. I never really thought about the ramifications for military personnel until I was approached by a military family who told me that their greatest fear was their next reassignment, because they were here in Pennsylvania. They had actually stored embryos from IVF. I think their embryos were stored here in Pennsylvania 7, but they knew they were going to be reassigned soon. And as you've heard, this is not just a once and done. You don't go into the doctor's office and it's all done. It's a long process. They have no control over where they're reassigned, and they were afraid they would get reassigned to a state where they could not finish the IVF process. So the Military Families Association has endorsed this bill. Chemo patients, men and women, young chemo patients, are routinely told by their oncologists to bank their sperm, bank their eggs, so that they can later have a family. They're affected by this, and it's so many more.
And the bill,
Thank you, Susan.
the bill that the Republicans blocked and then voted against has a provision in it to allow military men and women to freeze their sperm and egg prior to a deployment to a combat zone. They voted against that.
Well, and some of your Senate colleagues have been very aggressive about going after reproductive freedoms in many other ways, right? Especially for military families. I'm thinking about one specific senator in particular.
Yes. Senator Tuberville of Alabama, who
the
state where today, if you discard a fertilized egg, you are liable potentially for manslaughter or murder, and who have said that. But then very quickly during the election cycle passed legislation that said, they don't solve the problem of the fertilized egg being a person. What their legislation says is that, we're just not going to prosecute. But that can change at any time. But you have to understand, I'm from Illinois. What we're seeing in Illinois are families coming from thousands of miles away to access reproductive technology in Illinois. But we're also seeing doctors leaving states and coming to Illinois, which leaves Americans in so many parts of this country without access to that care. And that could happen here in Pennsylvania as well. And we cannot let that happen in this country, because we cannot have a country where huge swaths of the population don't have access to basic health care.
And the current state of healthcare is, right now we have 20 states with abortion bans, several more with extreme restrictions. 1 out of every 3 American women lives in one of these states, including my home state of Texas. We've got multiple states with almost total abortion bans, no exceptions. And again, to Senator Casey's earlier point, we have a solution at hand, but we've got to elect our champion, send them back, and we got to flip a couple of seats too, right? We're working on that. at least 4, but we've got a lot of them right here. So I'm going to ask you, Senator Casey, because I think we're just about out of time. What's your closing argument to Pennsylvanians on this issue?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Well, I do want to thank Cedar Crest as well. I don't know President Meade is here, but she's not here. But I wanted to thank Cedar Crest for having us today. Look, the argument is simple. We're either going to protect a basic right or not. We're either going to be in a country where there will be the high likelihood of a national ban, but don't forget that we've already seen a cascading series of bans. 1/3 of women in the country are covered by a ban, and that 1/3 is going to grow. So we're already a country that has bans already. That's not like some future theoretical possibility. So are we going to be in a country that bans abortion, bans reproductive health care, or not? And that's the basic argument people have to make, or decision people have to make in this election. It is that simple and that fundamental. It will be decided this year. Don't think we can come up with a remedy 2 years from now or 10 years from now. This is the ball game. It's up or down on this basic right. And I think a lot of Pennsylvanians understand it is that stark a choice when you can see all that's at stake in the presidential race, all that's at stake in the Senate, the House, and increasingly across the country in legislative fights. So that's the question. It's ban or no ban. And it's in the hands of the voters in a couple of days.
Thank you, Senator. So in closing, the contrast is clear, the solutions are clear, the choices are clear. Senator Casey and his colleagues have a plan to fix this mess. We desperately ask you to help us help him do that. So 7 days, we've got calls to make, texts to make, doors to knock. I look forward to seeing everybody on the trail, and thank you so much. We'll be out there.